Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
So I don't know if you see that Victoria Williams tile. That's I think our graduate student watch party.
Oh, cool. Okay.
I think they're eating pizza and
Good for them.
and watching this today. So let's go ahead and get started, Kirill, don't you
Sure.
think?
Yes, absolutely. Let's go and get started, Mary.
Okay, it just occurred to me. If I'm introducing, I don't have a bio, but I will look one up right now. Hopefully it's on the webpage.
Oh, we just had
I can introduce myself.
No.
Take up less time, then I won't go over time.
Oh, that's all right, Jill. You know, we're good. You find it?
No, I did find it. Okay.
Okay.
Here we go. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start the Balkan Circle today. My name is Mary Newberger. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and a professor of history here at UT Austin. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, which is the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, which I just mentioned, in addition to the Center for European Studies, the Institute for Historical Studies, and the Department of History here at UT Austin. Before I have Kirill introduce himself, my co-host, I just want to put our statement for Ukraine in the chat. Ukraine is always on our minds, as we were talking about earlier, and I just want to make people aware that even though we're talking about the Balkans today, that we're thinking about Ukraine and we stand with Ukraine today. Kirill, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Mary. It's Friday. I'm excited. Yet another Balkan Circle, a good tradition, which became from local to transnational. My name is Kirill Avramov. I'm an assistant professor. I'm a political scientist. I'm at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at University of Texas at Austin. I'm also the director of Global Disinformation Lab, which is hosted in the same unit. And today, after a very exciting start, we're going to be having a really good speaker, very interesting topic, and I'm looking forward, Mary, to introduce our speaker and without further ado, to go into the interesting part of the Balkan Circle.
So yeah, it's my pleasure today to introduce Jill Massino, who's an associate professor of modern European history at UNC Charlotte. She's the author of Ambiguous Transitions, Gender, the State, and Everyday Life in Socialist and Post-Socialist Romania, which came out in 2019, and also numerous book chapters and articles on gender, citizenship, and daily life in socialist and post-socialist Romania, including an article she wrote for Communism and Rap. So I've known, which was a book I co-edited with Paulina Bren. So I've been working with and known Jill for some time. She's also co-editor with Shana Penn of Gender Politics and Everyday Life in State Socialist Eastern and Central Europe. And her current project, Friends in Need, explores Romania's relationship with several countries in the global South during the Cold War. Her talk today is based on her first book, Ambiguous Transitions, Gender, the State, and Everyday Life in Socialist Romania. Take it away, Jill.
So thank you, Mary, so much for the introduction, and Kirill. And I'd also like to thank the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Eurasian and Slavic Studies for inviting me to share my research today through their excellent Balkan Circle series. So it's a pleasure and honor to be here. And in the time I have, I'm going to try to give you a snapshot of my book, although I'm only going to focus on the socialist period because I fear in the interest of time we won't have sufficient time to discuss the post-socialist period. However, I'm happy to field questions about the post-socialist period in the Q&A period. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and I will warn you that there's a chance I could go over time. So Kirill, if you need to stop me at any time, I'm fine with that. I practiced this presentation a number of times. I saw where cuts could be made, and it was too painful to make those cuts because the stories I felt were just so powerful. And so, as I said, if you want to cut at any time, just let me know, and when we can leave it at that, and we can return to that in the Q&A. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you all.
Thank you, Jill. And of course, like we'll try with minimum intervention. We know how painful it is to cut, especially the good stuff. Floor is yours.
Okay, so let's see. So we've got our slideshow here, and I want to make sure. Can you see it still really well, or is it now?
Wait, it just went out of slideshow view for some reason.
Yeah, the problem is I have my notes up, and so when I put it in full slideshow view, then I can't see my notes.
Let's see. That's so odd. Well, I mean, we don't mind watching it this way, but
Are you able to see it well, everyone?
Well, we see three. We see. Oh, I see. It looks like we see multiple slides, but
yeah.
What
if I move it over a little like this? No.
Oh,
we tested this and it seemed to work fine, but it's not now, huh? What do you say?
No stress. We can go like this. Not a problem. What do you think?
This is totally fine. Yeah.
I mean, otherwise I could share it with one of you, right? But I have a lot of notes and there's a lot of information and I wasn't able to use my printer. It was malfunctioning, of course. This is what always happens. So, and anyway, any case, I'd like to start so that we don't lose more time here. So I've got the cover of my book. It's entitled, as Mary said, Ambiguous Transition. And it looks at gender, the state and everyday life in socialist and post-socialist Romania. And so my major aim, my overarching aim with this book was to really illuminate the ambiguities, but also the complexities and sometimes contradictions that I encountered in my research on Romania, but also with my conversations over the years with Romanians, which really went against my perception, at least when I first visited Romania in 1999. And of course, my misperceptions, my understanding of the region was heavily informed by where I grew up, the United States, Cold War, America. And my notion, of course, of the Eastern Bloc and particularly the Soviet Union was, of course, of a society in which individuals lacked agency, which was gray, which was drab, which was repressive. And, of course, as I said, I grew up with this very kind of Manichaean conception of, liberal democracies in the West versus communism and the evil empire in the East. And I was, old enough to remember watching the made-for-TV series the day after, and the threat of this nuclear war. So that was also kind of hanging above my head. So, recent conversations about that really kind of bring me back to this in a way, although I was pretty young at the time, so I had a different understanding and appreciation for it. But I also had this notion that, that there would be an Eastern Bloc for a large part of my life, if not for the entirety of my life. And so when the Berlin Wall finally fell, right, when communism collapsed in Eastern Europe, it was a really life-defining moment for me. It was really transformative. And, that happened. And then, of course, the narrative of the triumph of liberal democracy and of capitalism took over, right? So, and I was very hopeful, certainly in the early 90s, even into the early 2000s, about these former Bloc countries, right, Eastern European countries, being able to transition effectively, to be able to return to Europe, to people's, standards of living increasing, improving, obviously to the fact that they were able to travel freely, associate freely, speak freely, et cetera, et cetera. So, but of course, what I encountered as a result of my research, and in particular my conversation and oral histories, was that the story was quite different, and I needed to really undergo deprogramming just on the one hand about what I had learned about the Cold War, but also then what I learned about the supposed triumph of capitalism and liberal democracy. And so, what I aim to do at this book is look at these ambiguities and look at them from multiple perspectives and at multiple levels, right? With respect to legislation, with respect to how women and men were represented in the media by socialist propagandas, and also with respect to people's experiences. And so how I came to frame this period of both socialism and post-socialism is through the fact that in my conversations with individuals, both prior to my research when I conducted oral histories, but of course then afterwards, is that people had very complex and often positive recollections of their period, of their experiences under state socialism, right? Some felt that they were more empowered and more in control of their lives under state socialism. And certainly that was related to the fact that they were working at that time, and that work had been guaranteed, that it was a right. That they could afford childcare, right? That childcare was subsidized, that they could afford to take a holiday at the seaside or in the mountains, that they no longer could, right? And so they had these very positive recollections. And what I want to underscore is that these recollections weren't just nostalgia tinged recollections, right? I mean, it's one thing to remember being young at the seaside, but it's quite another thing to remember having a stable job in which you're able to bring, food home and live a relatively, at least certain type of life. And that's not to say people didn't experience precarity and uncertainty in the 80s. They certainly did. But during the 60s, during the parts of the 70s, there was this level of stability and certainty that people, at least a number of people I interviewed in the 2000s, did no longer experience, no longer experienced under this kind of triumphalist neoliberal capitalist society. So I want to kind of highlight the fact that we can't just write these positive recollections off as nostalgia. And while many pundits and certainly members of certain parties in Eastern Europe and certainly in the US as well might write off socialism as a political system, as a way of life, it really continues to shape how people think about their governments, their society, their communities, and themselves. And so what I aim to do really here, what I did, I hope I did, was looking at the complex, ambiguous ways in which people experienced socialism, right? There were episodes of oppression and repression, but there were also experiences of being emancipated, feeling empowered. There was the monotonous or maybe the exploitative alongside the joyous and the pleasurable. There was the ordinary alongside the extraordinary. And so I want to look at these, in comparison to one another to provide a more nuanced portrait of state socialism. Of the leadership, of the government, of the policies, but also of people's everyday lives. And of course, socialism is significant because we're talking about a system that purportedly, claimed to completely transform people's lives, but they were particularly targeting, right, the laboring class, the proletariat, but also impoverished peasants and women. So it makes sense, of course, to understand, to explore how women experience socialism, because they ostensibly had the most to gain. And, I think it's important also in the case of Romania to look at gender, because until recently, so until the last decade or so, really women's lives have been seen through the prism of pronatalism. And I really wanted to get away from that, right? Because those portraits tend to deny women agency and see them as objects of policies and as sufferers, and really also offer kind of a very, very partial, selective view of what parenting entailed. And so part of my intent in writing this book was to get away from those narratives. Now, I want to highlight that all this being said, I in no way believe or regard the former socialist government as legitimate. So that is, obviously, these were regimes that were not popularly elected nor popularly supported. But the memories of those who lived and worked and took holidays under socialism, I do view as legitimate. And so this is one of the major engines driving the book. And so I aim to validate, but also historicize their experiences, while also recognizing that they occurred under this regime in which that committed repressive acts, often of a violent nature against their population or certain elements of them. Okay, so I've kind of scrolled. Can you see the second slide?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So why gender and everyday life matter. So obviously, I think it's kind of a given for us experts, historians, why gender matters. You can't really fully understand any historical period without examining gender. And that doesn't just mean examining women or just examining men. It means examining their relationships and how ideas about femininity and masculinity are constituted. I would argue the same about everyday life, although certain historical periods it's more challenging to kind of capture everyday life. But I feel that these two vantage points, looking at gender, looking at women and men's contributions, but also looking at how they interacted with one another on multiple levels is essential for understanding societies in a more complex way and really teasing out these ambiguities. And this is especially illuminating in a period of transition, right? So where you have gender identities and roles being rapidly refashioned, right, and reinscribed. And so what I do in this book is I use gender to explore how socialist modernization was implemented. And this has been done by other scholars throughout that focus on the Soviet Union and various parts of the bloc, but also Western Europe, this idea of women's role in the process of modernization, right? And socialist modernization, of course, was different than the modernization we saw in liberal democracies and capitalist societies, but nonetheless, individuals, men and women, played particular roles. And so during this process of modernization, I examine how ideas about men and women influenced policymaking, social organization, and how they were mobilized either through coercive or persuasive aims measures to participate in this process of socialist modernization. So I mentioned why, gender, I think, is important in the socialist context because they ostensibly had the most to gain as a result of their status under, what the state claimed was an exploitative capitalist system, right? But also gender was an important ideological tool that all socialist states used, Romania included, that they could argue that their society was more progressive and it was more forward-looking, certainly, than the Western one, where women enjoyed full equality in all spheres of life with men, right? That they were able to achieve economic autonomy and craft their own futures, which was something that women in certain Western countries did not enjoy. And in certain respects, of course, they were right, but it was a part of also this larger geopolitical struggle, whereby socialist regimes could illustrate and emphasize their superiority to Western capitalist societies. Now, in looking at socialist modernization, I also acknowledge that there's ambiguities and there are darker sides of this. In the case of Romania, one of the darker sides was the fact that women lost reproductive control, right? When abortion was criminalized in 1966 under Decree 770, women no longer had control over the fertility. You could argue that was happening elsewhere in Western Europe at the time. But the point is that coexisted with the fact that women were also at this time being promoted into science and technology and engineering. So you have these different types of policies, one repressive, one regressive and repressive, one progressive alongside one another, right? And so here you see these ambiguities. And that, again, I think helps us explain why people can have both positive and negative recollections of this period, even within a similar time frame. I noted this is also true of the West, of course, where you have progressive and regressive policies alongside one another. And one of the things I also do in the book is try to put some of these policies alongside Western ones at the time, particularly as they relate to reproductive rights, particularly as they relate to the rights of LGBTQ individuals, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so to sum up, I'm looking at how gender roles and identities were constituted by the state in legislation, in media, in film, and in various manifestations on the official level. And I examine, though, how this process then shaped individuals' sense of womanhood, manhood, right, of femininity and masculinity, and then how gender served as a frame through which they understood, right, the society in which they lived. And so that means how women would have grappled with gender hierarchies as they encountered them in the workforce, how they would have negotiated their roles with their spouses, how they might have challenged them in certain circumstances, but how maybe the family served as a sphere in which traditional gender norms were reinforced, right? Often going against what was promoted by the state. And certainly I'm not just looking at gender in isolation, I'm looking at how gender intersected with other identities, so age, class, and certainly we know these social societies still continue to be class societies, even though state ideology argued quite the opposite, and we'll get into that in greater detail. Ethnicity, origin or location, and sexual orientation. And just a word kind of on ethnicity, what I mean here by ethnicity in this context is that I looked at, I interviewed women from various ethnic backgrounds. Because my research was done not only in Bucharest, but in Brașov, I was able to interview a handful of ethnic Hungarian women, also ethnic Germans. I was actually able also to interview a Jewish woman. I was not able to interview any Roma women because I did not have an intermediary to work through, unfortunately. So that was not encapsulated in my oral histories in terms of my subjects. However, of course, Roma is an important part of the analysis, and certainly there were in the reflections in the oral histories with other individuals, there are discussions of Roma individuals. And then also sexual orientation, although none of my subjects identified as gay or such, but this is something that was obviously important to take into consideration. One more thing about gender, I don't want to make the claim, and I don't make the claim that all of people's experiences were necessarily gendered, though. In some cases, men and women equally suffered. If you think about, a cold apartment in winter, where the heat has been turned off, men and women are equally suffering, right? So there were instances in which gender might not have mattered that much or did not matter at all. So I don't want to kind of overdetermine this gender analysis either. And so I want to underscore the fact that gender isn't always kind of the most salient category in which to understand what is happening. Okay, so obviously, I think it's clear already that I see individuals as both objects and agents, right? So they're objects of the state, they're tools, they're being used to help modernize the country, to industrialize the country. Women are also being used as tools for reproductive demographic growth, right? So especially when you see when abortion is recriminalized in 1966. But of course, they could decide how to respond, at least within reason, right? They could choose how they might respond to these particular policies. They might kind of flout them, maybe in a very careful way. They might resist them, although publicly endorsing them, but resisting them in private. They may embrace them and reappropriate them. They may kind of work the system to serve their interests. So the point is that people had power. It might have been limited, and it certainly was varied over time and with regard to context, but they did have a modicum of power, and that they were able to wield in certain circumstances. And I think this is important because it gets to the continued kind of critiquing of the totalitarian paradigm. And I kind of felt by now, like as scholars, we wouldn't have to remind our readers that the totalitarian paradigm is invalid, but it continues to be instrumentalized, right, by political elites and others. And so I think it's worth mentioning that we need to acknowledge that exists, that it has power, and it has staying power. And in that, by critiquing it, we demonstrate that the earlier system, the communist system, was not totally illegitimate, that people were not totally powerless, and that this period of history is worthy of study and should not be written off, right? And to not enable these policymakers then to also instrumentalize it. And I think there's clear that this connection between agency and everyday life, right? This gets me back to part of the title, the subtitle, Everyday Life. So my approach is to look at gender, but also to frame it through the perspective of everyday life. And so, I draw on this idea of Alltagsgeschichte that was authored by Alf Ludtke, who looked at Germany, and then of course he looks at Nazi Germany, so he looks at Imperial and Nazi Germany, and really looking at how people were able to wield some power, might be limited, in spaces where one would assume that there was very little power to be wielded. And I draw on historian Maureen Healy's notion or definition of everyday life, its utility. And she argues that everyday life is history enables scholars to write about politics and the workings of power in a given historical context and emphasize human agency in the process. So, everyday life history illuminates personal responses to policymaking, to governance, and allows us to really understand the varied ways in people interpreted policy and propaganda, but also made spaces for themselves, engaged in resistance, dissimulation, engaged in mockery, and even kind of affirmed or accommodated themselves to policy. How they worked the system, right, to procure particular services that they might need, and simply how they were able to muddle through. My next point, I think it's related to this, that I see individuals as not being subjects, right? Because if they're just subjects, then they're on the whole agency list, right? And I already acknowledged that they did have agency. So I see individuals in Socialist Romania as being socialist citizens, right? And so this is a different type of citizenship than we would see in liberal democracies, right? And on the whole, individuals are denied political rights. Yes, they can vote, but it's a very tokenist measure. They're denied many civil rights. They're denied freedom of association, of speech, of travel in certain circumstances, particularly in Romania. But they do have certain economic and social rights. And for some people, these economic and social rights, and what do I mean by them? Guaranteed employment, access to schooling, subsidized housing, subsidized vacation. In some cases, those were more important than political rights, particularly for individuals who see politics is meaningless, right? Although they don't often see the relationship between these two, but nonetheless, these social and economic rights were very important for them. And when they lost them in the post-socialist period, this is why they were critical of what happened in the 90s and the 2000s, because they saw the erosion of some of these social and economic rights. And I think it's important to acknowledge also that, these socialist regimes, it wasn't only characterized by repression. Here, we're talking about a project of social engineering, where these states are trying to create a literate, a cultured, a healthy, a kind, a considerate population that's devoted to socialist collectivism, right? To transforming society and how people relate to one another, to transforming gender norms. But at the same time, as they were doing this, egalitarianism didn't exist across the board. There were examples in which hierarchies existed. We know this with respect to the types of privileges that certainly members of the nomenclatura and the high-ranking communists enjoyed. And also with respect to the earlier part of socialist rule, when individuals with unhealthy social origins, so I'm talking here about people who were interwar elites, had connections maybe to the reactionary parties, to the fascist Iron Guard, were denied full rights, and actually their children, this kind of stigma could affect their children as well and their children's educational pathways. So this kind of idealized notion of citizenship that was implemented by the state often kind of played out differently in practice. And there were some affirmative action policies that certainly helped some groups, but then alongside that, others that very much disempowered groups and excluded them from some of the benefits that others experienced. Okay. I also examine continuities and ruptures, and I think, with any period of major transformation, we want to kind of chart these dramatic shifts and changes, but there are always continuities. And certainly there was, in the case of Socialist Romania, there was continuities with the pre-socialist period, and there's certainly continuities between the socialist and post-socialist period. One of these might be, the importance of tradition, right? And traditional notions actually of gender as kind of a stabilizing device that might in some cases actually go against state policies. Or some of these continuities could be exhibited by the regime itself in terms of how it treated, let's say, particular minorities, sexual minorities, as an example. So my book also looks at these continuities as well as ruptures. And I don't see the socialist period as necessarily being this dramatic rupture, especially how personal relationships played out on an everyday level. Okay, and finally, the relationship between socialist ideals and everyday realities. And, we want to see this disconnect between the two, that there's this huge gulf between, what was presented in socialist and Marxist philosophy and what was experienced on an everyday level, because that, of course, contributes to the support of the totalitarian paradigm and also to the notion that, this was an illegitimate system and that liberal democracy and capitalism are superior. But they weren't, in fact, and sometimes there was a convergence of socialist ideals and everyday realities, especially some of the values that were promoted by the state. And I mentioned a few of them: this idea of being healthy, of literacy, of subsidized schooling for everyone, of subsidized housing, of people having basic standard of living so that they could support themselves and their family, and of Of course, that changed during periods of socialist rule, especially if we look at the 80s when these benefits were eroded. But these types of ideals and then these policies, the idea of supporting community members was to some extent embraced by individuals. And so I like to kind of think of the relationship between socialist ideals and everyday realities in terms of a Venn diagram that you see overlap between them. So not on this kind of polar opposite. And that's why I think it's so important to kind of present the repressive episodes that people experienced alongside the more kind of joyous or even just quotidian ones to illustrate this complexity and that these two could coexist, and that people could, at the same time, though, kind of relate to some of the values that they were able to identify with some of the values that were available to them in socialist discourse and in the press. Okay. So I see already I don't have a lot of time and I'm worried about getting through all this, but I want to talk about some of my sources because I'm sure you're interested in knowing what I drew on. So I looked at official sources and unofficial or everyday life sources. So one of my main sources, and do you have this slide available to you? Can you see it? Yeah? Okay, good. Was the women's magazine Femea. And here's the cover of Femea from August 1964. So you have these two couples and they're celebrating the 20th anniversary. They're celebrating, the 20th anniversary, I was looking at that, of the liberation of Romania from Soviet troops at the end of the Second World War. And Femea was like other women's magazines in the bloc. There were patterns on how to make clothing. There was advice that was given by different types of experts. So they might be psychologists, social scientists, physicians. Readers would write in and they would receive responses, obviously often crafted to the questions they had. But the aim was, of course, to prescribe particular types of behavior, right? A part of this larger social engineering process. But sometimes the articles in the magazine were surprisingly radical. There were discussions of sexuality, and I'll get back to why you would have seen this. But for a sensibly conservative society, I was really surprised with some of the articles I encountered. There was also discussions of domestic violence, and so they weren't necessarily as scripted and as kind of let's just say unidimensional as I expected them to be. They were quite multidimensional. And one thing I really want to note about this source is that people took from these sources, all media sources under socialism, what was meaningful to them, right? They were able to interact with these media in a particular way. And so we cannot just assume that they were manipulative, right? That they were dupes to this propaganda, but that they engaged with these sources in particular ways. So I used the women's magazine Femea alongside a number of other periodicals. I also looked at the Communist Party daily Scantea, and this is the cover that is announcing the death of Stalin. So it was published on March 6, 1953. And also visual sources, so art as well as film. And here I have a film still from the movie translated as Postcards with Wildflowers, which came out in 1975. It was screened on select number of screens in cities in Romania, and then it was no longer shown, so it was just for a brief period. But it tells the story about this abortionist who basically enriches herself off of performing clandestine abortions, and much to, of course, the risk and ultimate fatality of a number of women, and women in this who's in the bed in this image ends up dying as a result of her unhygienic processes that she uses. But film was really significant in my analysis to get a sense of how the regime was trying to transmit these ideas, and also kind of in the case of this film, to use them as a scare tactic, right? To prevent women, even teenagers, from trying to seek an illicit clandestine abortion, because this would ultimately be their fate. And this is used elsewhere in other media as well, and we can return to that. So that's some example of some of the official sources. Other official sources I looked at, I examined included statistics, legislation, policies, right? And here we see the cover of the Labor Code of 1972. And also work by social scientists, right? Socialist experts on a whole host of issues as they were related to my book. So in this case, youth, child rearing, marriage, love, sexual health and hygiene. And the book I have included here is actually about sexual health and hygiene. It was designed for young people, so teenagers, but also young couples. And it was really a primer on sexuality. It had diagrams. It talked a lot about it talked about the processes that individuals go through, as they mature. And it was really aimed to, in part, to destigmatize concerns adolescents had, about menstruation, about nocturnal emissions, etc. But also you saw scare tactics here as well. The idea that birth control, especially birth control pills, were dangerous. Not that most Romanians could get a hold of birth control pills, but the idea that this is something that young women should not experiment with, and also the dangers associated with abortion, one of which was subsequent infertility, right? So again, it was used as an educational tool, but also embedded in this were particular messages about that very much supported the pronatalist policies at the time, and also reinforced highly kind of gendered conventional notions about men and women and sexuality. Okay, so then I included, obviously, one of the main engines of my analysis are these everyday life sources, which are unofficial, but also semi-official. So I have an excerpt from an oral history here. I'm not going to read it because I want to make sure we have enough time. But I conducted over 100 oral histories in the cities of Brașov and Bucharest between 2003 and 2012. So I conducted the interviews in 2003, 2009, and 2012. These are life stories that focused on childhood, youth, marriage, parenthood, leisure, and questions ranged from the quotidian to kind of major events and historical processes, right? So I wanted to be able to capture as much of their life as possible. As I noted, I interviewed a wide range of individuals, so of different ethnic backgrounds. Some of the oldest people I interviewed were born in the mid-1930s, and some of the youngest were born in the early 1970s. I wanted to kind of have early 70s as my cutoff because I wanted that individual to have kind of started to come of age, by the time communism collapsed, so that they were already in their adolescent phase. And certainly with all sources, there are issues of memory, of selective remembering, of selective forgetting, of sanitizing one's past. And that's why I really pay attention to how they express their experiences, to the silences that were evident in some of these exchanges, to what they emphasize and de-emphasize. And also, of course, I'm triangulating them right with the other sources to get this kind of fuller portrait. Even though I interviewed women who lived in cities at the time, of course, their rural upbringing, many of them were brought up in rural areas, so that very much influenced their life trajectory and how they experienced their lives once they moved to cities. So I by no means dismiss the rural. And even for those who were born in places like Brașov and Bucharest, they would visit their families, their extended relative, their extended family in the countryside. So the rural very much shaped how they thought about the worlds. Then I also drew on petitions or letters that can be found in the archive of the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party, right? So letters that individuals wrote to state officials, sometimes on the local level, sometimes they wrote them directly to Elena Nicolae Ceausescu. Sometimes these were letters that were praiseworthy, right? Praising Ceausescu's policies, but in other cases, they were critical, but usually not critical of the leadership itself, critical maybe of a coworker or of a local official or of a manager in their factory, right? They were very kind of careful in how they articulated their criticism. But nonetheless, these are very useful sources, especially as the 80s wear on and you get to a period of intense austerity in Romania, and people are just at their wits' end, and they're no longer as concerned about risking their situation, despite the fact that it might land them, in jail for a few days, or at least being interrogated by the Securitate. And so, as the 80s wear on, you see a lot more complaints. And then I also use Radio Free Europe letters. And of course, individuals could be a little less coded and careful in how they presented themselves in these letters, because they were being announced in the West, but they still had to be careful in case they were somehow intercepted. So those are some of the kind of what you could say everyday life sources that are unofficial, but also semi-official to an extent. I should note that I did not look at Securitate files. So I did not do research at CNSAS because, well, I felt, number one, that I had established these rapport with individuals, right? These over 100 individuals that I interviewed and spent sometimes over 2 hours with. And I felt like it would have been a betrayal to investigate their backgrounds by looking at their Securitate files. But I also felt that my aim was to understand their lives from their perspectives, not through a second-hand or third-hand perspective. And who's to know if even that second or third-hand perspective would have been accurate or reflective or insightful. And so I chose very intentionally not to look at the Securitate files. And of course, I also look at then contemporary scholarship, right? So scholarship that was produced on socialism after 1989, films, exhibitions, and other media sources and the like. And there's been some, of course, great works that were published, particularly in the 2000s. Okay, I see I'm already at 12:43, and I haven't gotten to my sources. So I wonder if I could skip the overview of the socialist leadership and just talk about my actual sources. Would that be okay with you? I think we have experts here. Okay, so I'm going to do that. And I want to start by talking a little bit about my second chapter. So my first chapter, which I haven't included here on the slide, just provides a historical overview of Romania up to the period of socialist consolidation, right? Socialist rule. And then my subsequent chapters looked at various aspects of life, right? So, and chapter 2 starts with childhood. And chapter 2, I titled Children of the Revolution, Gender and the Abnormality of Growing Up Socialist. And I chose to put abnormality, the AB in quotes, because I wanted to emphasize that while periods of people's childhood might have been somewhat abnormal, and certainly why we might perceive them as abnormal, many of my respondents said, I had a normal childhood. It was more or less normal. My parents tried their best to make sure I had a normal childhood. So I wanted to kind of underscore that for many individuals, they just reflected this on this as being a normal period. So the images I have here would be, an image from a typical primary school in Romania. And then the other image is of the periodical that was designed for children. So the children's magazine, the weekly, Cutazetor, which means the daring, from 1976. And I really like this image because it underscores some of the things I've already stated about gender, this promotion of gender egalitarianism, right? And this image also underscores the role of the importance of socialist modernity, right? And the fact that already at a young age, girls and boys are involved in promoting a modernization, right? Be it through scientific discoveries, and be it through cybernetics, as they called computing at that time. And you see an equal kind of amount of boys and girls being depicted in this picture. And indeed, egalitarianism was promoted, right? So girls and boys were obliged to go to school. Schooling was obligatory. And they both were promoted in the children's organization, the Pioneers, right? So there was no distinction made according to gender between, like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts as we have in the US. They were encouraged to participate in sports equally. And also, I already mentioned this, but in science, right? So we see girls and then eventually women increasingly participating in scientific fields, right? Science, technology, and STEM fields, mathematics. And so this promotion of egalitarianism at the level of youth was in fact really happening. Now there were some exceptions, and I'll get to that, but I feel like this image really encapsulates that kind of image of the equality between the genders. And I mentioned before, of course, that the aim of the socialist leaders was, of course, to modernize the country and to promote, to recraft, to refashion society and individuals, create what was called a new man, omolno. And so this total remaking of society, this social engineering, and they did this obviously through organizations and through media, such as the magazines that I mentioned, and in other initiatives that they promoted. But I'm going to kind of change gears for a moment here. While all this sounds great, as I noted, there were also exceptions. And particularly, you did not have a normal childhood if for some reason you were associated, somebody in your family had unhealthy, what was known as unhealthy social origins. And that was the case with one of the women I interviewed, Tudora, whose father, a philosopher, I'm sorry, my cat is kind of bothering me here, who was a philosopher and who had been imprisoned on political grounds for having studied in the West. So first he was imprisoned in a prison, and then he was sent to the Black Sea Canal for forced labor. And due to his conviction and this idea of guilt by association, Tudora, was interrogated by the Securitate at the mere age of 12, which was obviously quite a jarring experience. And so children sometimes had to deal with the stigma surrounding it, and just kind of the confusion. Why am I being interrogated? And so my quote is reflecting on how her mother dealt with this experience, right? How her mother helped to reinscribe her father's imprisonment as something ennobling and positive. Can you see the slide? Yes? Yeah, good. And so she reflected, my mother was extraordinary. My mother raised us to be proud of the fact that our father was in jail because the greatest intellectuals of the country were there. She said, you need to be proud of the fact that your father was imprisoned. And so I think this is pretty powerful because, it demonstrates that well, there were, during this period of the late 40s and early 50s, it was beholden on women largely, and not only to be the financial support system for children because many men were in prison, but also to be their emotional support system. And I mean, I think it was quite brave of her to transmit this message that she should be proud of her father, that it's not something she should conceal, that she should not see it as a stigma, and it should be kind of a badge of honor and pride. And also to teach her that, one can cope, one can be resilient, and that she should not feel that she has to conceal this, that she should not feel shame. And alongside this, her mother also talked about the importance of retaining her faith in her countrymen and women, and that because people were not necessarily to blame for the choices they made. And so, parents, particularly women, mothers, or maybe grandmothers, aunts at this time, played this really important role in helping children cope with situations that were very, very, very confusing for them to understand, and just kind of in certain circumstances, disheartening, right? Especially if you're surrounded by classmates or others who, are bringing this issue up that your father's been imprisoned and you feel like you don't fit into the community. But she said her mother played such an important role in destigmatizing this and really enabling her to have this sense of pride in her father that helped her further on. So she had the sense of resiliency as she encountered other challenges in her life. Okay, another example of I'm using about youth is kind of the reinforcement of traditional notions of behavior and attitudes. And so I mentioned how there was this promotion of egalitarianism, but then there were also very kind of conventional, we could argue traditional roles about how boys and girls were fundamentally, right? That you couldn't trust boys, that boys would be boys, and as a result, girls needed to take care. So this quote Cleo was reflecting on sexuality and dating when she was in high school. And she noted the teachers didn't say a word about sexuality and relationships. They were condemned during this period. If you had a boyfriend in high school, it wasn't very accepted from a social perspective. Girls who had boyfriends were categorized as promiscuous. And my sister, were not allowed. The prevailing belief was that you needed to be careful because boys can ruin your future. So on the one hand, individuals had this message that, oh, boys and girls are equal. But on the other hand, this coexisted with this kind of sharply gendered notion that women had to girls had to rein certain behavior in, that there was this double standard that they had to take great care because their reputation, could be undermined as a result. So you see the prevalence of patriarchal mentalities. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. How are we doing time-wise?
I think, we're approaching. I hope that we can go for a little bit more. But
okay, just stop me. I have quite a lot more, but just stop me if need be. Like I said, it was so hard for me to cut. So
I know, no, it's fascinating, and I'm enjoying it very much. So go ahead, Jill.
I hope I can get to Spartacus, because Spartacus comes up in this this presentation. Okay, so work. Work was obviously the definitive aspect of socialist citizenship, but it was both a right and a duty, right? So people were obliged to work, but it also conferred a host of rights if you were worked. And certainly workers were glorified, and especially heavy laborers, but also women laborers were glorified as well. And certainly we know that Marx and Engels, especially Engels, talked a lot about the connection between women's liberation and work. So this idea that if women could be fully employed, right, and earn their own wage, they would no longer be dependent on men, and this would be the key to their liberation. And only through socialism could women be liberated. Certainly, the state also needed a lot of workers, so this discourse was very useful in killing two birds with one stone, right, modernizing the country and also promoting women's liberation. Also, low wages helped get women into the labor force. So, right, by being able to lower wages in general, many families needed to rely on a dual wage earner kind of a paradigm in order to support their families. And indeed, many women of working age were employed in socialist Romania, be it in the factory, be it on the farm, and they were employed for the entirety of their lives, largely. They were underrepresented, however, in traditionally masculine fields, so heavy industry, in transport, and you still saw them, highly represented in areas like textiles, in teaching, particularly primary school, kindergarten teaching, secondary schooling to a little less, obviously in care services and nursing, although there were quite a lot of women doctors. Although I did say women did increasingly participate in the STEM fields, right? So they were promoted into these fields. And one of the reasons why was because the regime tried to push them out of arduous jobs, right? So more physically arduous jobs in the late 60s, early 70s, because they were worried that these would negatively affect their reproductive health. And also to kind of get away from the Stalinist model in which women kind of more equally involved in more heavy industrial work, because it had proved to be kind of emasculating and also not necessarily attractive to some of the younger generation that was coming of age. Suffice to say that the workforce was segregated both vertically and horizontally, that there was a gendering of the labor force throughout the socialist period, and that there was a regendering that was introduced in the late 60s, early 70s, that the male industrial laborer was the most glorified, the most vaunted, and had the highest status largely, if we're looking at blue collar workers and in general.
And possibly paid,
but
right?
what were women's, yeah?
I said, and possibly highest paid, right?
But what were women's actual experiences of work? And so I have 3 slides to give you a sense of the varied ways in which they experienced them. And I will start with the kind of conventional, like you'd say this one aligns in a sense with the totalitarian narrative of work being under socialism as being exploitative, as being unfulfilling, as being mind-numbing. And this is from Oijinya, who was a quality control manager at a factory. And she noted that you could say it was the work of animals. People didn't talk. Everyone was like a robot. People came to work Saturday afternoon, second shift, and left the next day, Sunday, and they didn't produce much. They were not very efficient. I wouldn't work those Saturday night shifts. I didn't follow the herd. I told them it was inefficient for people to work at that time, that they were too tired. I gave them my opinion, but I didn't get in trouble because I was very good at my job. So what I think is really interesting about this reflection is that it reinforces the totalitarian narrative, but it also demonstrates that women did have agency, that they mobilized. And she was trying to actually argue in support of her, employees too, who were working under her, that people are not efficient, that it's not normal to have to work a Saturday night, that people should be with their family, right? And she had also kind of talked about how work was like being in jail. But she said because she was good at her job, she was able to kind of escape those weekend shifts. And so that's why I think it's a very kind of powerful reflection that embodies both of those perspectives. The next recollection is by Tatiana, who worked as a textile worker in Brașov, and she had come from an impoverished rural area in northeastern Romania, outside of Botoșani, and she came during this period of great migration in the 60s and 70s. And she was accustomed to a kind of arduous, difficult life. And so for her, she had these very positive reflections of work under socialism, particularly because she lost her job in the early 90s, right? So she also understood it through that lens. And she said, I have the impression that the period was good. It was very good. I was taught to work at a young age. I believe that regardless of the regime, if you're diligent and if you work, you will live well. I worked 8 hours. I came home, I put a meal on the stove, and I had time to read. I read a lot then. I led an ordered life. Yes, we worked on Saturday and sometimes on Sunday, but to be honest, that didn't disrupt anything. And so clearly for her, work was not arduous, and she had been accustomed to it. And she also, you could argue, she's kind of professing some of the same values that were promoted by the socialist regime, right? To be diligent, to take pride in one's work, to be accustomed to working, right? Work as kind of a measure of one's character. Okay. That said, of course, there were certain challenges that women encountered in the labor force as well. One of them was harassment, although there wasn't really a name for harassment. And a number of women I interviewed talked about facing workplace discrimination, be it being mocked because it was believed that they were not as skillful as their male colleagues were, sexism in various forms, harassment. Sometimes, bosses would flirt with them. In certain cases, they would grope them or even kind of hint at sexual favors in exchange for promotion and bonuses. And especially in male-dominated fields, it was challenging for women to kind of to demonstrate their worth and their capabilities, because even though ostensibly what men and women were equal, this idea of skill was still gendered very decidedly as male. And so one of the women I interviewed, who was an engineer, Maria, reflected on her experience working in this team of all men, with the exception of herself. And she said, what it was like? It was a personality conflict. It was a continual battle working with men. First of all, it was very difficult to demonstrate to them what I knew, that I knew it well, that nobody else needed to follow me, a man, for example, to correct the work once I had finished. After they got used to me, they treated me with dignity. They never talked badly to me. They never used vulgar words with me. I would not tolerate it, nor would I speak in a vulgar way to them. I had two choices, either act like I didn't know anything or to be unusual. And I preferred to be unusual. And so in Maria, in order to kind of diffuse the situation and create harmony with her male co-workers, which she describes as personality conflict, which is clearly a gender conflict, embraced this idea that she was kind of this unusual, exceptional, oddball woman. And she was also very good at her job as well. And she noted by this time she was used to dealing with men, who egotistical men who thought they were better than women. So she had been kind of practiced in dealing with this and kind of refashioning these situations. And she'd also been interested in science since she was a child, right? So I talked about that promotion of STEM. And so she felt very confident in her capabilities in her job as an engineer. And also recall that she was reared on state discourse that validated women's roles in a whole host of spheres and their equality of men. So she was able to incorporate that into how then she was able to relate to her male coworkers. Okay, now I know we're at 1 o'clock, but if I could just give one more case study, it would be fantastic, because I would like to give you a laugh. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you very much, Jill. We're going to
Great.
do one more, and I'm sure that because I know that people are staying and want to have questions.
Okay, great. And then so I won't be focusing on my last 2 chapters, but that's fine. Okay, so I want to move on now to my 4th chapter, Love and Marriage and the Transformation of Marital Roles and Relations, or not. And of course, marriage was promoted in Socialist Romania like it was in other regimes, and it was seen as the foundation of building a moral and healthy social society. So keep in mind, we're talking about a heteronormative society, right? There was no same-sex marriage. And socialist leaders were particularly, conventional when it came to marriage. Marriage was also important because, of course, if you're trying to promote demographic growth, the likelihood of having more children within marriage, there was a greater likelihood you'd have more children within a marital union. And so as a result of that, and because as I noted, Romania had decriminalized abortion and had this pronatalist initiative that they introduced in 1966. Divorce became increasingly difficult to procure. It was very difficult to get a divorce. It was expensive, and it also continued to carry this great social stigma, right? And so, of course, the regime also capitalized on that social stigma. And so the regime used both kind of negative and positive incentives to promote marriage. One of them was to make divorce difficult, but another one was to reconfigure marriage in the press, and particularly to reconfigure the roles of men within marriage, also the roles of women to an extent. So that men should recast these, cast off these patriarchal behaviors and values, and they should not treat their wives as inferiors, but help around the house, right? Because a man who, sits in the chair, reads the newspaper, and smokes a cigarette or cigar is bourgeois, almost barbaric, outmoded. But they also argued that women contributed to this kind of differentiation of roles within the home because, they had been reared that women should do all the housework and that they should no longer be at men's beck and call. There were these marriage quizzes that appeared in Femea where men and women ostensibly could evaluate their marriage. There were also pieces written about marital problems. And what was interesting is that men were not only chided for their supposed laziness in the kitchen or in terms of child rearing, but also in the bedroom. And so these 2 images I put up they're designed to counter this notion of kind of the lazy, selfish husband, right? So here you have a man who is holding his baby. He's also got a duster, but he also has a briefcase. So he can, bring home the bacon and fry it up in the pan. And his wife can just look beautiful, right? Almost bourgeois in a way. And this was a part of a larger column called The New Kind of Husband. And then these articles about women's sexual pleasure, and this piece about frigidity talked a lot about men's insensitivity to women in the bedroom, and how men needed to be more sensitive to women's needs, sexual needs, women's sexual satisfaction and pleasure. Now, this is highly radical for a socialist society, conservative one like Romania. But again, we have to keep in mind that pronatalism is being promoted at this time, right? And the idea was for women to have more children. So if they enjoy sex more, ostensibly, they will have more children. And quickly, my case studies about how marriage actually played out and how women contested their marital situations. So the first one was a reflection from Valeria, who was a nurse and who married, at a young age. And she noted, when I married, there was a difference of 12 years. I was 20, he was 32. I had just come from adolescence. I went into marriage straight from boarding school, not knowing how to defend my interests. When I realized that a woman could defend herself, and when I realized the slogans that were being used, equality between women and men, I began to earn my rights, my freedom of thought, of behavior, to rest, to take part in raising my child, not to be an obedient slave. I would not take it, especially when I saw the movie Spartacus. I decided to leave because I realized I was not put on this earth to be a slave. And so what I find really interesting here is that here she's using this discourse, right, socialist discourse, but also messages that are coming from Western popular culture, right? Because this was a period of cultural liberalization. She had access to these films. And she, like other women, talked about men being educated in a particular way, that they were not educated, that they were not culturally educated in a progressive manner. And this is why they acted this way. And she contested that, though. She felt empowered enough to contest it. Another example of where a woman contested it, and I hope you get a laugh on this one, was by Elena, who wasn't talking about her husband, but her boyfriend, who she lived with in the 1980s. And she reflected, he expected me to treat him as his mother did, but I did not do that. And his mother told me that it was my duty to wash his trousers, to cook for him, to clean for him. And I said, okay, is he disabled? I can help him if he's disabled. If not, he should do these things himself. And from that moment on, I totally refused to do these things for him. And little by little, he was able to wash dishes, to cook eggs, and to wash his trousers. So here it's interesting because it's not just her partner, her boyfriend, but his mother. And you would see these articles in the magazine Femea as well, where husbands would complain, my wife's not around, she's working late and she's taking night classes and she's not making my meals and not cleaning the clothing and cleaning up the house. And then his mother would chime in the article where, oh, you're not doing your wifely duties. And so you clearly saw this generational and gender shift happening, and it was happening in practice as well. Finally, my last slide here is about how individuals contested this successfully, or in some cases didn't need to because they had sensitive husbands. And as a result of necessity, they had to kind of share these duties. So one is by Corina, who reflected, the mentality was no different. The woman at the frying pan, the man as the leader, but I didn't accept it. I didn't want to accept it. I said, in the first place, we are both people. We both work. We both bring in money. We will do everything together. And so this underscores that this notion of work was much more capacious than this idea of working outside the home. It also included working, working in the factory. It included work at home. So work was not just about leaving one's home and working in the factory or at the institute, but it also meant housework. And she argued that because both her and her husband were working, they both needed to contribute to this. This is also about self-preservation. If we think about the duties, the responsibilities individuals had at work, sometimes having to work overtime. If women assumed all this work, they would get no sleep. And indeed, some women didn't. But those who were more fortunate to have men that did help around the house were able to kind of somewhat preserve themselves. And then if you put it in the context of queuing up in the 1980s, right, for as a result of shortages, it was necessary for men to be more involved in housework, and in particular things like food procurement, because women couldn't take it all on. It was literally impossible. And so my next quote just talks about, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it discusses how Aneta was able to share her duties with her husband. And what's important about it is that it contributed to how she evaluated her marriage. So for her, the fact that she could share these duties with her husband, her partner, was so important that it meant it was a happy marriage. And she led, what she said, an easy life. And a number of women underscored this. I had a husband who helped. He also didn't drink a lot. And so I had an easy life. I'm going to stop here. I wasn't able to talk about 2 chapters. And I really thought I would get through this faster, but this is how it happens. So please feel free to ask me any questions about what I presented here or what I've left out.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for this fascinating and very detailed talk. As I was just, a number of things were going throughout my head. multiple questions, but I would ask, the people that are in the audience if they would like to pose questions, because I certainly have several ones based on, some of the sources. For instance, I'm very interested to see whether you were able to see any statistics or any information regarding the gender balance in the workforce, or that is, there was a big debate in after the transition in countries such as Romania, as you know, and Bulgaria, for instance, about the so-called feminization of professions. And for instance, and you touched a little bit on that, but I thought that this also is something very important to consider in terms of the future trajectory, of those roles and rights and responsibilities and so on. While that I'll try to open the discussion, I'm going to ask people that are with us here to ask their questions. We'll prepare them for Jill. Jill?
Are we waiting for questions?
Yeah, we're waiting for people that are thinking about questions, but I just wanted to ask, whether you have seen any statistics or information about the so-called feminized professions throughout the period that you're writing about.
The socialist period and post-socialist period.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so they continue to be feminized. Women continue to be overrepresented in areas like healthcare, although you had a lot of women practicing medicine, but you had women doctors in the interwar period as well. Concentrated more at the primary and secondary level, not as much at the college level. You had, like I said, some women kind of moving into male-dominated fields, but they were a minority. So in construction, in transport, or if they're, one of the problems is even if they're represented in the statistics in those fields, so I could do my screen share, but for instance, in an area like construction where women were about 9%, it's hard to know what roles they assumed in construction. So were they on the construction site, or were they a secretary there? Were they playing kind of in a supportive role? Were they working as a cook? And so this is where you kind of see, this different type of segregation happening. So even if women are present in those male-dominated fields, it's not necessarily on an equal footing with men. Same for female-dominated fields. If women are overrepresented as textile workers, it was predominantly women, but often the managers were men, right? And so you definitely see the replication of these gendered practices that you would have seen at the West at that time. The exception is STEM. And this is the real great exception throughout the bloc, right, in the Soviet Union, where women are entering the STEM fields. They're working as chemists and geologists and biologists and nuclear energy. And they're assuming these, and of course, engineers, and they're assuming these jobs that women aren't assuming in the West, right? And they're being promoted into these areas because they're needed, but also because then that frees up space and that those kind of heavy, more arduous jobs, right? Heavy labor jobs. And because those are professional jobs, right? I mean, if you think about the younger generation, do they really want to work in a factory, or do they want to be a scientist? And they're being promoted at a young age into these fields, right? And so that's where you really see a differential from the West.
Thank you very much. You've addressed it. And I also very much enjoyed something which I caught as a nuance, and I know it's in the book, but you reiterated it very importantly about the multidimensionality of what I will call about socialist nostalgia, and not only in gender terms, but in generational terms. And you have illustrated how people were having this ambiguous relationship with the past. On one end, this big question about what constitutes as social rights and social comfort. And immediately when you were talking about Romania, I was thinking about, in the case of Bulgaria, the so-called three keys policies, right? The key to own an apartment, the key to own a villa, and then a car that you waited for forever, as my parents did. But you had this, and in retrospective, people have very ambiguous understanding, of what was provided. And, as you mentioned, you were trying to talk, about sanitizing the past. certain aspects of it and then selectively kind of putting a bias. But before I continue, because I can go on a lot of things that I saw, and actually I really love the humor that you have employed, especially the one is kid disabled, this example, and the Spartacus, of course. I would like to ask our colleague Keith Wagner. Keith, would you like to address directly your question in the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Massino, for this. I really liked seeing the magazines you were showing. And I actually, for my own research, have been working with more like 1890s Romanian periodicals. And so, this is a very different period. And I was wondering how you accessed these, because I think these are great, like, sort of capsules of theorization of different things. And what you were talking about with the omul no, I sort of see it in the more francophone period as la femme moderne is theorizing the modern woman. And so there are all of these parallels. And I just wonder if there's a place to access these socialist period publications, or if it's more you compiled it another way. Yeah.
Yeah, so I accessed those at the libraries. When I was doing my first round of dissertation research in Brasov, I went to the municipal library and they had them there. And that was back when I was using a scanner, a portable scanner, and now you can access them at the library. Any I would imagine most municipal libraries, but certainly in Bucharest and a number of locations. And I feel like I could have talked forever just about that publication. Really rich and just, surprisingly rich, right? So these articles about asexuality were really, they make sense if you put them in the context of pronatalist policies, but really explicit, right? And again, people responded and interacted with them in particular ways. And so that's why I tried to read them in a very rich manner, right? To offer multiple possibilities of interpretation. And again, I couldn't even get to the multi-layer. I could have spent an hour just talking about some select magazine articles, but I really wanted to show how the sources operated alongside the recollections and to underscore that, individuals, that the propaganda was shaping how they experienced their world and not necessarily in a negative way. Because I think it's easy to kind of argue that they were dupes, but if they were feeling empowered by what they encountered and some of the slogans that were being disseminated and some of the images that they had access to, we have to take that seriously. So I argue that we have to take this media social seriously, but we can also read it against the grain at the same time, right? We can offer multiple interpretations. I think there were some more questions.
Thank you. Well, actually, Rock is, because he says he needs to log off and run, but he's saving a question for you for your visit to Ljubljana in 3 weeks' time. See, the circle is spilling secrets, like we know your travel plans. Thank you, Rock. I would like to ask the participants, as we are very short on time by now, if you have any questions that you want our guests to address. Okay. Well, in this case, I would like to thank Jill for the wonderful presentation that we have, and especially for her patience. And sorry if I came out a little bit rude or interrupting or anything, but in so many events specifically today, and I'm very glad actually that we didn't miss the circle. I would encourage everyone to follow our guest and read the new things that she has published. And we're looking forward, Jill, to have you again.
Thank you so much. And I apologize to everyone that I couldn't get through, my presentation. I did get through the bulk of it. So I had some really fun slides on consumption and, then the demise of socialism. So we didn't quite get to the demise, but it's so hard to cover a 360-page book. And it was very hard for me to delete. So I kept going over this presentation and wanting to delete things. And I felt like, oh, I can't get rid of this. And when I went through it the first time, I actually made it in time. I don't know. I guess we started a little later too. So it's fine. Yeah. But I apologize that we didn't get to have the full portrait.
You were fantastic. Thank you very much one more time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And you know, we're so appreciative. I'm sure everyone agrees with me that you've organized this circle, and it's such a beneficial and enlightening forum for scholars and for others. So
thank you. Well, Jill, we do appreciate the kind words because as previously we have, and our colleagues, especially UT, know that it was an internal seminar, sort of an experiment where we can have really in a form of a circle incorporation of people that are relatively early in their career, research career, and the earliest sort of, we had were graduate students. Then we have the doctoral students and of course the experts. But then the interest in the work, surprisingly, because we were so tired of hearing, well, the area is so narrow, people possibly would not be interested and so on. And then all of a sudden, we're in our third year and we do have regular people that are coming. But also for me, this is very important, transnational public, which is general public, and people would come and they would actually write to us, do not change, the Friday format or the time, because we're waiting for the Balkan Circle, which is, I think, the best thing, the best gratification, for me as a co-host. But the whole thing, I wanted just to thank before we part, this could not happen without people like Kara and Molly and our wonderful staff at Crease. Because it's a lot of work. And we usually convert, the presentations and the lectures in our YouTube channel. And then people, of course, do visit them if they didn't have a chance to come. So Jill, one more time, thank you very much. Fantastic. And we're looking forward to have you again. And please be a part of the circle.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. It was such a privilege to be able to share my research and continue what you're doing. And I think, it's one of the unintended positive consequences of COVID that it forced us to go online, but we've realized that actually this can work in our favor and it allows us to share knowledge and learn about one another's work in ways that we wouldn't have been previously. So I'm grateful to you and keep it up, all of you. Thank you.